No reira tena koto katoa. Kia ora, I'm Rod Oram, and it's my great privilege to be your MC for this lunchtime webinar. And I hope you enjoy your sandwich and your drink if you have it by your side, as you enjoy the discussion this afternoon. At this time each year, the Green Building Councils from across the globe join together to support the World Green Building Council's annual campaign to focus on better delivery of sustainable greener buildings. This year, Green Building Councils from the UK, South Africa, India, Malaysia, Singapore, Australia and New Zealand are calling on the building sector, policy makers and governments to take urgent action to deliver net zero buildings. Globally, this year's theme is #ActOnClimate. So please do tweet now and later on that hashtag. That would be much appreciated. To pursue that great challenge here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, it is the great pleasure of the New Zealand Green Building Council to bring you this sixth event in Aotearoa's Green Building Week. We in Aotearoa, along with the rest of the world, are facing two substantial challenges. We need, on one hand, an effective economic stimulus to get us out of our deepest recession in more than 100 years. But we also need to slash our climate pollution and to stop the climate crisis deepening drastically. These twin interdependent challenges will not be solved unless healthy, less polluting places for people are put at the heart of the solutions. Thus, this is the most important time ever for our economy here and around the world, for all of us to be involved in some way in the built environment, and so that we have a key role in tackling these era-defining problems. And that's what makes this year's World Green Building Week so vital. The campaign this year has three themes. First of all, for communities, so net zero buildings supporting a healthier and more sustainable built environment and helping to create thriving and resilient communities. The second theme is for the planet. Buildings account for more than 1/3 of global carbon emissions. So it's vital that we prioritise net zero buildings today to protect our planet and future generations. And thirdly, net zero buildings for economies, because investing in new and existing net zero buildings today can stimulate innovation, activate supply chains and create jobs. So to act on these three themes, the Green Building Council here in New Zealand has been hosting this week this series of panel discussions tackling the big issues, such as can the financial services sector be a catalyst for change in this? And how can we fully realise the enormous potential for social and green procurement? The title for our webinar this afternoon is Shovel Ready, Can It Ever Work? Well, we know one thing for certain: we can't keep doing all the things we have been doing for years. We have to achieve extraordinary things over the next few years to get us started on the enormous transformation we need to meet our goal in Aotearoa of net zero economy by 2050. But the pandemic is helping us to equip and inspire us. Here's one of my favourite quotes so far for these virus times. COVID-19 has already triggered major shifts in individual behaviours, social practices, beliefs, the role of the government in the economy, and relationships between nations and international institutions. These shifts have occurred on remarkably rapid timescales. Those wise words were from the Smith School of Enterprise and Environment at Oxford University, when it released in May its seminal analysis on how we can, how we must, to use the well-worn phrase, build back better. And here's another quote from the same report. You can do these things quickly. Many of them are labour intensive and many of them have big multipliers. So wrote Nick Stern, a former World Bank chief economist, also he of one of the groundbreaking economic analysis of climate change and our response back in the 2000s. who now chairs the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. The leader in all this is the European Union, which has agreed on a nearly €550 billion plan for green projects over the next 7 years, the largest single climate pledge that the EU's ever made. The money, in fact, represents a 30% share of its extraordinary €1.7 trillion budget for 2021 to 27, and it's part of a €750 billion COVID-19 recovery fund. But if we adjust our population and the money to scale down from the EU to us, that large sum is actually only 5.5 billion New Zealand dollars for our 5 million people in Aotearoa. So that's money we can certainly afford, considering the government is working through its 50 billion COVID response and recovery fund. But where's the plan? What criteria is government using to pick such projects, for example? So to help us get to grips with these issues, the Green Building Council has brought together a panel of people with deep expertise, strong opinions and lively personalities to help our discussion on this. Now, we're very keen to make this a very interactive discussion. So please, do send us your questions and comments via the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom window, because that's where I'll be turning to read what's on your minds. And now, it's my very great pleasure to introduce the first of our 4 panelists, each of whom will speak for about 3 minutes. So the first panelist is Shamobeel Ekwab, a member of Sense Partners, a consultancy firm. So Shamobeel is an excellent economist who makes economics easy to understand. So he's an author, media commentator, and thought leader in many ways, and has over a decade of experience in New Zealand and overseas as well. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, Shamobeel. So over to you, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Rod. And what a great introduction, and what a great topic to be talking about today. We've already had, I think, the experience of 6 months of incredible compressed change and big decisions. We're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars. We're all sort of grappling with some big stuff. But can it work? It can only work if the objectives are right. When we think about how we deal with problems, we can do it in 3 ways. First, we can tinker with existing policies. There is a hell of a lot of that going on right now. Second, we can introduce new policies. That's harder. And the third is where I think we're having this conversation today, is change the goals of what we want to achieve. Currently, we're still trying to think about our economy and our response in an old world view, which I find very frustrating. So infrastructure is the go-to thing for delivering fiscal stimulus, and it makes sense because it's job rich, both during the time of the investment, but also the legacy that it leaves. But the legacy, we know with climate change, can be both positive or negative. We could lock in bad ways, carbon-intensive ways of doing things that will stay with us for many decades to come. Here is a great opportunity for us to think and rethink what it is that we want to do. Yes, we want to create jobs. Yes, we want to have long-term gains, but we really want to make sure that those investments that we make now are not pushing us and locking us into redundant and awful ways of doing things. We know that what the government has to do, as always, must try and maximize the economic and social impact. They need to be consistent with the broader public policy objective. But it also means that when we're choosing these investment projects, that they're consistent not just with those economic and financial objectives, but also our climate commitments and requirements for what is required over the next 100 years. One of my greatest frustrations in public policy is we deliberately discount what our children and grandchildren will go through when we assess our projects. And yet we know that as society, that's amoral, that is immoral, it is wrong. We cannot discount the needs and the impacts on future generations, particularly with investments and spending that will leave a legacy for 100 years or more. So where are we today? Today, we're in a place where, as us as citizens and government is willing to act, we're willing to throw billions of dollars at our economy and at our society. If we're going to do this right, shovel ready can only work if we make sure our objective includes not just more jobs now and in the future, but also making sure that we don't wreck our planet and our community by doing that. And when we talk about infrastructure, we have to widen the scope. It must include other things like human rights, which includes shelter. And as you know, that's one of my big things. We have failed to provide high quality, safe, affordable, secure housing. If infrastructure doesn't include something that is a basic human right, we're doing something wrong. My plea to all of us today, and for the government and for our citizens, is think about what is it that we're trying to achieve. It's not going to be done by tinkering on the edges of existing policies. We have to ask for a different outcome. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Shamabeel, and particularly that great range, taking us to thinking about the future, but also thinking of future generations, but also thinking about the human rights that are very much in play here. So thank you. And our second panelist is Jenny Cooper QC, a highly regarded commercial litigator with particular expertise in companies and securities law and competition law and insolvency. Jenny is also the inaugural president of Lawyers for Climate Change Action New Zealand, which brings together lawyers to advocate for action against climate change. Jenny has previously held a number of other leadership roles in the profession and joined Shortland Chambers in 2011. Before that, she was a partner at Bell Gully. So, Jenny, a very warm welcome to you, and over to you.
Thank you, Rod. Tēnā koutou katoa. It's a privilege to be here today with such a great panel, talking about such a great topic. As a commercial lawyer, I am moderately surprised to find myself speaking at a Green Building Council event, but very pleased to be here. Really, my take on this question is similar to Shamabeel's. I think potentially shovel ready could work in the sense that what we need is change in action and activity. So undertaking big changes and doing so quickly is what we need to do to achieve a zero carbon future. However, my concern is that we are putting the cart before the horse, because what we need to get to zero carbon is system change, and a change in how we evaluate projects, a change in our objectives, as Shamabeel was saying, a change in how we go about making decisions. And we haven't yet done the work to embed those changes, to understand what our long-term plan and vision is of how we're going to get to zero carbon. And so by rushing ahead with projects now before we've done that work, I worry as well that we are simply entrenching carbon emissions into the future. Now, in terms of timing, we didn't have any choice about when the COVID-19 crisis struck us. And unfortunately, it has also delayed the work of the Climate Change Commission, who are at the moment busy preparing the first carbon budget and carbon emissions reduction action plan. And those are now expected to be ready in May next year. Now, really, until we've done that work and we've really thought about the trajectory the country needs to be on and how we're going to do that, I think it's unfortunate and premature to be spending billions of dollars on projects which may or may not help to get us there. So that's one of my big concerns about it. The problem with the whole concept of shovel ready is, of course, the emphasis on ready, and what we have ready are old projects. And they're primarily projects that have been developed before people were really thinking about these, about the zero carbon target or the 1.5 degrees target under the Paris Agreement, and actually how urgent and how much we need to do to get there. Certainly in the time I've been involved in climate advocacy, which is not that long, but I have been struck that it's still very much not a core part of thinking in a lot of the agencies and organizations and ministries that are doing the work to develop these projects. It's still seen, I think, as not part of their core job to think about those aspects of carbon emissions. And so I am worried that they're not being adequately taken into effect. Now, during the COVID lockdown, Lawyers for Climate Action wrote to the Prime Minister and the the budget ministers to say that we wanted to see a real emphasis on emissions and climate in the recovery and stimulus spending. We urged emissions impact to be a core part of all that decision making. Somewhat depressingly, all of the ministers we wrote to referred the issue to the Climate Change Minister, James Shaw, and he was the minister who responded. And I think that in itself indicates a real problem with how climate change is still being viewed. It's being viewed as a kind of niche add-on subject and not a core part of everybody in government's responsibility. Now, we were assured by Minister Shaw and by other ministers in public statements have also referred to the fact that they're going to apply a climate lens to all of this spending. Unfortunately, when we saw the COVID-19 Fast Track Consenting Act, that climate lens is not to be found in the Act. The Act does not include any clear requirements to take into account climate emissions. The impact of projects on emissions is a discretionary factor that the Minister may take into account along with a whole lot of other factors. And the primary objective of the Act is on promoting employment. So while we've had these assurances that a climate lens will be applied, it's not clear what that means. It's not legally mandated. And we're left very much really dependent on the individual choices made by ministers around the cabinet table ultimately in terms of what gets referred under the Fast Track Consenting Act. And the process, of course, has been very narrowly constrained in terms of public participation and appeals. So I have some real concerns and reservations about the process. I think it's a missed opportunity the way it's been set up at the moment in terms of making sure that the spending really does get us to where we need to be. And certainly Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand is going to continue to watch very closely the decisions that are made and how they're made, and we'll be doing our best to remind decision makers of their legal obligations, including, of course, the government's international legal obligations under the Paris Agreement. And as Shaman Beale has referred to, also human rights obligations, because I think what we're increasingly seeing internationally, and we're trying to encourage more discussion of here in New Zealand, is the human rights aspect of climate change and these issues. And we've seen recently, for example, the Agenda case in the Netherlands, where there was a successful case against the Dutch government based on failure to uphold the right to human life because of its failures to take adequate action on climate change. So that's where I'm coming from on this. Thanks, Rod.
Fine, thank you very much indeed, Jenny. That legal perspective is incredibly important and sheds some real light on the inadequacies of the government selection process so far, which is definitely a subject we'll be coming back to in our discussion. So thank you. Our third panellist is Adrian Miller, who's General Manager New Zealand for the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, and influencing really important works like the City Rail Link here in Auckland. So Adrian is a lawyer by training and a solicitor of the High Court and a member of the Institute of Directors, and has worked as an executive and advisor for over 20 years in waste, building products, construction and infrastructure industries, and also in the public sector water utilities, and working for companies such as Downers and Fletchers and Carter Holt Harvey Water Care and Waste Management. So very strong background in infrastructure. So welcome, Adrian, and we're very keen to hear your thoughts, please.
So a number of the things that Shaman Beale and Jenny have already mentioned are views that I share. So I'll just sort of run through some of my thoughts. In terms of whether we've missed an opportunity, I think maybe we have. When we look at the lists of projects that have been selected for from the economic stimulus package, they do seem on their face to be meritorious, and you can see, for instance, really good regional spread and you know, a fair amount of job creation. But I'm not convinced either that the right criteria were applied when we were assessing these projects. We might have got it right, but we'll never really know whether there were better projects out there, because I think the relatively blunt metric of number of jobs created and ability to deploy quickly, probably, as one of the other panelists has already alluded to, drove us towards projects that were already on the books rather than truly transformative ones. Now, I read something the other day that said that to really shift the dial, and Shamabeel touched on this, you can't just make sort of tweaks to the status quo, look at how you're already doing things and continue to do it, a kind of incrementalism. You've got to envisage a different future and then figure out the pathway to it, which I guess is a different sort of build back better. There's certainly been some great envisaging that's been done here in New Zealand, but none of that has come through in terms of what's actually being funded. So I think we need to think about this, you know, the scale of the investment and what's been invested in and how we deliver it, because as has already been alluded to, the scale of that investment will preclude further future investment, because the sort of infrastructure and other assets that we're investing in will be with us for a very long time, maybe even up to 100 years, as Shamabeel said. What I heard and I got told round the traps was that there was a feeling that taking a view on what I'd call wider considerations, sustainability in its broader sense, might take longer and cost more. And I don't really know if I accept that myself. I think there are already tools available that we could have used to measure, and in this case, verify impacts. They were already on the shelf, and we also have, you know, this amazing living standards framework that we could have applied to look more broadly at what the impacts of our investment was. I think we've looked far too narrowly at the what is being procured without considering the how it was built, and we could have, you know, really missed an opportunity here to achieve a whole lot more. Another gripe I have is with this whole speed thing. So I think there's really a real risk when we operate at speed for the default to be made to existing governance structures where perhaps there are less, and the question that was posed to me is around gender, and, you know, there being less women involved in that and less other. I mean, I don't normally like that phrase other because it does assume a monocultural view, but, you know, where we continue to operate at speed, you can default to those existing governance structures and inadvertently perpetuate biases of the past, both in terms of who's involved in the decision making and, probably more importantly, what's considered relevant to that decision making process. And why is that bad? Well, because design and build really impactful, valuable, resilient assets. You want decision makers that are diverse, that, you know, that mirror the population demographics of the communities of people that will be served by that infrastructure, or we hope are served by that infrastructure. And that diversity of thought also yields greater innovation. So I think that the how and the what and the breadth of the social impact that could have been achieved in cultural reference, etc., might be a great missed opportunity, not to mention the broader sustainability environmental aspects, which the other panelists have already touched on.
Fine, thank you very much, Adrian. Very useful contributions there, particularly that sort of insight from what you've been hearing around the traps, and that very narrow view that's being applied at the moment, but also reminding us that there are already terrific tools to deliver some of these and to help make decisions on some of these projects. Thank you. And our fourth panelist is Simon Wilson, a former editor of Metro magazine, where he bravely ran very challenging work such as John Stevenson's From Afghanistan, Cuisine magazine, the spin-off Auckland, and of course since 2017 at the Herald. And I can say this as a journalist. I have to say that Simon is an astonishingly productive and pithy writer on issues, particularly those involving Auckland, but also across a great range of issues, whether they be water or the arts, or from walking or to council-controlled organisations and anything in between. So anyway, Simon, great pleasure to have you on the panel. So over to you, please.
Thank you, Rod. That was very kind of you. Kia ora, everybody. Shovel-ready has obvious advantages. We're going to spend a lot of money. The processes will be sped up. We're going to get some desperately needed infrastructure fixes, we hope. And it's a chance, as people have been saying, to reset in ways that incrementalism doesn't often allow. But there are real problems. The first one is that this is it. We're going to spend billions and billions of dollars now, and it's unlikely there'll be more money or appetite or capacity for other spending to follow. And while it's an opportunity, it's not conducive to good planning. There are questions about whether we even have the capacity to spend the money we want to spend now. When you speed things up, it's risky. Corners get cut, as Jenny and Adrian have both said. Do we know how to do this yet? Do we have the proper framework in front of us to make the transformation we want? We risk getting the easiest rather than the best or the most needed or the most valuable for the future. So there are a number of questions that really concern me. The first one is there a social consensus for a reset? Labour and the Greens, in this, because we're in an election campaign at the moment, Labour and the Greens both use the phrase building back better. And it's a pretty widespread phrase used commonly overseas as well. I've noticed that National and the ACT Party don't use that phrase. So in that sense, there's no obvious consensus just yet. It's not clear what Labour means by it. And I'm not sure it's really clear that Labour is driving a sense of transformational change, of really building back better in the ways we might need. Because they know there's a difficult balance. People want comfort and they want reassurance. And people are scared enough now, and after the second lockdown, that became much more a real thing than it used to be. We haven't bounced out of the second lockdown in the way we bounced out of the first. People do want that reassurance. So saying to everybody, actually, we're going to have a whole lot of change is a hard thing to do. And you can see that the Labour politicians understand that. They're wary about just how much they want to promise or even go there in the campaign. And then you look at the fact that we're not very good at talking about these things anyway. The Auckland Harbour Bridge has been an object lesson in how things can go wrong and not easily be addressed in this country, in my view. A freak gust of wind blew over a couple of trucks and took out half the bridge for some days. And the first response of a lot of people was to say, let's get it fixed now. Why can't we get it fixed now? If we were in China, it would already be fixed. And which is a kind of ludicrous way to approach this issue. I think we rightly like to think that we do things well and carefully when we're talking about engineering, and we don't rush in. And of course, we don't have the resources to have enormous steel girders hanging around waiting just in case we might need them one day. It takes much longer than people readily understand. The dominant narrative, though, from the bridge was, oh no, there's total chaos. It shows we need more of what we've already got. In other words, it shows we need more roads. And it didn't show that. However, that was the dominant narrative. So what happened on day one is that a whole lot of drivers took the bridge anyway and got caught in traffic and waited for hours. On day two, they took the advice of Auckland Transport and tried the alternative route around State Highway 18. So many of them did that became the more clogged up route. And on day three, they started to say, what, there are buses? The buses haven't been full in the whole process, which tells you two things. One is that there are a lot of buses and a lot of people understand their value on the North Shore and have been using them well. But a whole lot more people haven't got it in their heads that actually there's a better way to get over that bridge. It's better in normal times, and it's certainly better at the moment. So that kind of thinking there's a lot more work to do to develop it. And I think one of the real disappointments was that there were, as far as I could work out, no political leaders at local or national level who have said, actually, this points us to the real need for a rail alternative, because the rapid transit alternative to the bridge is the only sensible way to approach this. So instead of saying, okay, yes, we do need more roads, actually taking the opportunity to say, this is why we need to have that mode shift. We need to be getting far more people out of their cars and onto rail. And that probably means tunnel. The importance of mass transit. But there wasn't that vision. There weren't politicians articulating it. And it's the real thing that we've been missing. The bridge, as with everything else, at local and central government level, we're not very good at talking about it. COVID has given us some really big challenges now. The lack of decent housing, I agree with Shamabeel. I think it's probably the biggest one that it's thrown up. Fragility of work for the low paid. The safety fears about public transport is a new issue we have to confront. Safety fears about living in apartments. Public transport and apartments, which were the dual benchmarks, if you like, of how to have a denser city, there are issues we now have to confront and resolve about those because of COVID. The death of High Street, very, very hard issue, caused by online shopping, working from home, collapse of visitor numbers, and the climate crisis did tend to get forgotten. So the infrastructure rebuild has to address all of those, and I think housing and the breadth of work and reskilling, although they're difficult, are probably the easier ones. What we do about public transport and departments is harder. What we do about High Street is really hard. And I think what we do about climate change, although you might think it's going to be easier, it may become harder. It's really noticeable in this election campaign that although among the Labour and Green side, they do talk about it a bit. On the national side, just yesterday, the new agricultural policy announced had a subtext of we're going to walk away from this issue. The leading voice of the leading political voice in the rural sector is encouraging its supporters there to look away. And although they might technically say that's not what they're doing, that really is the message I think that's being delivered. And that's a real problem, that we don't have the political leadership to move the agricultural sector in the ways it needs to go. Even though there is such potential for exciting change, this is a moment now where we can see the need for mass transit, cycling, building construction to much better green standards, residential and commercial, new ways of looking at energy, agricultural reform, the potential of regenerative agriculture, work reskilling aimed at higher wage economy and wider participation in it, and cultural identity too. The CRL railway stations, which I know Adrian has talked about before, terribly exciting in terms of the potential they show for reflecting ourselves back to us. And yet at the moment, this election campaign we have, it's like it's a false election. I think after the election, we're going to get, whoever wins, we're going to get much more serious discussion happening suddenly about how are we going to support job seekers and beneficiaries. The question of a guaranteed minimum income or something like that, I think may come into play. What are we going to do about the future of hospitality and other sectors of the economy? There'll be a fast track of, in some way, if I can use the pun, of light rail or mass transit for Auckland, also perhaps Tauranga, Hamilton and Wellington, and RMA reform. All these things are too hard to talk about now because they don't look like issues you can win an election with, but they are the real issues underlying the campaign at the moment. They all feed into this question of how we do shovel ready and how we make it meaningfully better rebuild.
Fine, thank you very much indeed, Simon, for that breadth of very helpful ideas there, ranging from some very specifics about Auckland to the very important post-election landscape that we're going to see, regardless of who wins. First of all, to all our participants, I've got a few questions in the Q&A box, so please add more. But for panelists, if I thank you very much for your four strong, well thought through views there. Can I just start with I hope a simple answer to a complicated question. The complicated question is, do we think the current government has actually had a plan that in some way brings these climate wider sustainability issues into the shovel-ready projects? And I think you've all been quite clear about that, but can I just ask for a simple yes or no answer from each of you as to whether you think the government is actually applying any of these important criteria to these shovel-ready projects? So over to you, if I may, for a simple yes or no.
It's a yes-ish from me. There is a degree of it, but a fairly low degree.
I'd agree, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm going to join the masses and say that too. I think partly.
Yeah. Jenny?
Yeah, I think that the whole problem with it is it's ish, it's vague, there's no clear criteria and no clear process for doing it. I'm sure they are trying, but I'd like to see them do that in a more clear and legal framework would help.
And thank you. And Shamabeel, yeah, your sense. And by all means, shave between yes and no.
I committed to a no, because in my mind, the climate change goals must be a bottom line. It's not something that's fancy and nice to have on the side.
Yeah.
So I'll change mine to that as well.
All I'd say from my point of view is that as hard as I've tried, I haven't found a greater scheme or plan. And there have been some words and there have been some bits of money, but the money's completely unconnected. So there's money for a hydrogen refueling network around the country, but there's no money yet for how we're going to generate the hydrogen or for the trucks that might then use the hydrogen. So there's that kind of problem.
I think also, just you mentioned hydrogen fuel, but it seems to me that if a government properly serious about this would have some flagship policies which it would be putting forward. And one of them would be, here's the phase out date for the internal combustion engine. Just going to put a date on it now. California's done it. We could do that. We could easily do that. And that focuses the mind in so many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me move on to a far more complicated question, which is, given that on one hand we're waiting crucially for the important carbon budgets coming from the Climate Change Commission later on next year, and we've got a lot to understand about what system change and how to do it. Is it, though, still possible to make some progress and to pick some projects, even though we don't know that bigger picture of the ultimate goal or the best way of achieving that system change?
I think there's a danger with incrementalism. Like we talked about earlier, I think you've got to have some bigger picture goal and objective.
Yeah.
I think there are two projects that ought to be right in the forefront. One of them is mass rapid transit in Auckland, and the other is much more public housing. And I think if those two were completely prioritised, much else would fall into place.
Jenny?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, although I said before that, we're putting the cart before the horse by trying to do all these things before we've got a plan, and we're waiting for the Climate Change Commission to give us the plan, essentially. One of my frustrations has been that we actually know, before we hear from the Climate Change Commission, most of what they're presumably going to tell us, because it's not that hard. We know we have to cut emissions, and by how much and by when. We have a pretty good idea of where those cuts need to come from, and we have some ideas about how those could be achieved. And so things like massive public transport is a clear, obvious one, and improving housing is another one. So I agree that we don't necessarily need to have all the parts of the plan in place to start with some of those things. But like Adrian, though, I am slightly worried about incrementalism and just having a couple of big transport projects in Auckland is maybe not such a great idea unless you've worked out what your overall transport solution for Auckland is.
Could we have had, though, for example, or could we still have, for example, a program that would need to grow and scale up, but hopefully quite quickly, to retrofit houses, for example, because that's very labour intensive, and we might not have the skills, and so we would need to skill up more people. But we are starting to see a decline in new consents, so maybe some capacities opening up. But the difference between job intensity in a lot of vertical construction, albeit only 2 stories, versus horizontal construction, roads and the like, is very marked. So could we at least do, kick off that kind of program in this response?
There was a program I remember reading about somewhere that had been done, I think in the Netherlands, where they had done retrofitting and they'd actually funded it with some sort of energy long-term energy deal, and that was funded and it was recouped from the spend on the clean heat type initiatives. And we've certainly done that sort of initiative before. There was something rolled out in Christchurch post the earthquakes that was similar in that way. It got rid of all the chimneys and put in clean heat.
Look, if I can just add, I mean, New Zealand's got the experience with it. We've been through the Healthy Homes Bill and all that kind of stuff. There's actually a lot of capacity, which is not necessarily related to the construction side. So it's a little bit to the side of that. So if we wanted to retrofit our homes, we would have the capacity to do it. We're not saying you should do all the houses in 1 month, right? Because we've got half of our housing stock in New Zealand was built before 1980. It's, you know, so we have awful quality housing in New Zealand. Some of it's pretty third world stuff. And that's where we have third world diseases like rheumatic fever that kills, you know, and injures hundreds of people a year. So from that perspective, that should be a priority, but it has been something that we've known about for a number of years, right? Philippa Howden-Chapman has been talking about this for absolutely years. This should be a priority if we care about the things that we say we care about. We say we care about housing, we say we care about poverty, we say we care about health, but we refuse to fund this stuff. My sense is that, yes, the COVID thing has been a big shock. It still hasn't hurt enough for us to make that dramatic change that everybody's talking about. We're still stuck in incrementalism. What we're seeing with Shovel Ready is incremental. It is not a regime change. It's not a different goals that we're trying to achieve. So until that happens, until we kind of hold the fire, you know, for politicians' feet to the fire, I don't think we're going to see that change.
In terms of how we try to move this or the next government on this, an interesting question from one of our online attendees. Does the panel think that the projects which have been approved for shovel-ready funding should be paused or subject to a sustainability review?
I'd love to see that happen. I mean, let's face it, in many cases, the ground hasn't been broken yet. I mean, I guess one of the concerns, and I saw there was another question there too about why we couldn't retrospectively apply IS ratings. And we could, but there is a better outcome when you do them right from the start, from when you're designing the projects.
Thank you. The next question I'm going to pose is one about Auckland, and again from our participants online. Where does Auckland's climate plan come into this? We need big changes now in the transport sector to achieve greenhouse gas emission reductions, targets our councils and politicians have adopted, yet we are still focused on moving vehicles and improving travel times for general traffic. Does the climate plan have any teeth or any momentum or any delivery capacity?
It's an excellent question. The climate plan is pretty good. Doesn't have the teeth it needs. One of the example that was given in the question of far too much focus still on moving cars around on roads is a very good one. I did a session the other day with Minister of Transport and Urban Development, Phil Twyford, and his counterpart in National, Chris Bishop. And we talked about some of this, and Twyford said, interestingly, that one of the priorities for him will be to instruct Auckland Transport to put mass transit at the centre of its planning from this point, which raises a couple of issues. One is the government actually telling an arm of the council what to do, which is a bit of a change from what we've had, but getting fed up with the slow progress. And the other one is the question itself of that being the right thing to do. And as I've said before, I certainly think it is, the mass transit. So Auckland's climate, it's terrific that Auckland has declared there to be a climate emergency. It's terrific that it has, I mean, the year before last, it rejected the first iteration of its climate strategy and sent it back to the drawing board and had the officials beef it up. And that's happened now. It's good that that's there. But it has to be carried through with real teeth, with a real sense of, okay, we just need to shift the focus now. And that requires, as I said at the very outset, a lot of politicians at central and local government to be talking about it lots, explaining why building the vision, creating the enthusiasm for it. We discovered in this country this year that we can get enormous public buy-in for a big public project, and that was the fighting COVID. We could build on that. The government with the will and the leadership that is, as we know, much admired, has the potential now to build on that. So we need to see them doing it.
If I can just add one thing, I think the challenge with those commitments is that without real change in the tools that you use and the funding and the oversight to make sure you actually deliver on those things, that nothing changes, right? So we signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement, but we didn't move very fast after we signed the damn thing. So unless you're willing to change your behavior and hold yourself accountable to the things that you've signed up to, it's really difficult for us to have the impact and the change that we need.
That's right. There is a,
Sorry.
I was just going to say, Jenny, there is a real gap in every council plan between what we know from the IPCC is going to happen in the next 10 years and the timetable the council is working on. There's a reality gap right the way through it, and that's a real problem for it. I'm sorry, Jenny.
No, that's all right. I mean, obviously, that's not unique to the council. I think that's consistent for pretty much every public body. But what I was going to say is the council climate plan actually does have teeth. It is actually a legal, it has legal effect. So Auckland Transport, as a council-controlled organisation, is required to act in accordance with directions from council, and it's required to act in accordance with policies that it's directed by council to follow, which includes the climate plan. So what I find absolutely extraordinary at the moment is the complete disconnect between what organisations like Auckland Transport are doing and what their legal obligations are, because they actually do have statutory duties to follow those sorts of policies that are set out by council. Now, they will say quite reasonably, well, we're constrained by budgets, we're constrained by New Zealand transports, we're constrained by all these other factors, and that's true. They don't have complete freedom about what they do. But I still am surprised by the level of disconnect that we're seeing between these different layers of policy and the pronouncements on the one hand being put out by council and what's actually happening. And I think there is scope to actually get a lot more serious and say, look, you can't just have these documents and leave them on a shelf and not pay attention to them. They actually need, they fit within a statutory framework that needs to be followed. And I think we all need to be better at holding everyone to account. And, that includes ministers as well, who, the government has signed the Paris Agreement. We've undertaken these international commitments. It's not good enough to just act as if we haven't. There's this cognitive dissonance going on at every level of government that needs to stop. And I think we all need to demand better, frankly.
Let me just pick up on that because I would love to get to grips with that cognitive dissonance. Can we suggest some ways individually and collectively that we can start to break down that dissonance and start to get some real connection going on here?
Well,
I think one of the things, sorry, I was going to say, I think one of the other problems with that is that everybody is doing it. Someone I was talking to the other day described the kind of interface of policy and overlapping nature of policy is a bit like watching 7-year-olds play a game of soccer. Everybody was swarming the ball and no one was engaging in positional play. And I think there's some of that. Everybody's doing the same thing. Where are the accountabilities? Who has what roles? So there could be a whole lot more clarity, I think, in the policy landscape as to be really clear on who's doing what, because it seems like a lot of people are doing the same thing and all at once.
Does that mean that who then is singularly or collectively the coach and the captain who starts to sort out people's assigned roles? Or
in Jenny's case, who's the referee, which is very important, and maybe it's all of us.
I like that idea, yeah.
One of the things I like to do when I write about these things is to treat them as mainstream ideas, which I'm not lying to anybody. I think they are, but it's very easy for politicians who are slow to come to this to treat addressing climate change as a fringe idea, to treat the idea that people have the right to living in a warm, dry home as a fringe idea. And they're not fringe ideas. Most of us believe these things. So I think we always need to be talking about them as if they are mainstream ideas, and therefore it's aberrant not to be doing more about them, rather than a weird idea that we need to somehow still wrap our heads around.
I agree. In every survey, we find that New Zealanders care about these things.
Yes.
But there is disconnect between what we care about and what we're doing. So it's this disconnect between the actions, but also this lack of a feedback loop to hold us to account. That accountability must be strong and it must be enforceable. Otherwise, our politicians get stuck in the incrementalism that we're in. And this is, we understand this is what happens in any democratic system, but we have an opportunity now, as you were saying, as all of you were saying before, we are making these huge investments now. It seems churlish not to do the things that we actually care about.
Is that a good reason for some of the mechanisms that are coming through in sort of new democracy movements, such as citizen assemblies, where they are very carefully chosen people for those assemblies who absolutely represent a cross-section of the public, but also there is a real commitment from the government to act on what the citizens' assemblies come up with. Should we be urging all of us, ourselves and our politicians, to embrace such new mechanisms?
Certainly, well-designed citizens' assemblies can be very powerful, because I think it can break down some of those myths that New Zealanders don't care about this stuff, that we don't want to pay for certain stuff. At the moment, there is this kind of all the private polling that shows, these people like this stuff and those people don't like these other things. Well, actually, if you put those people together in a room and they talked about it, we might reach a consensus. At the moment, we have no method of reaching a consensus. That, to me, is the thing that worries me, is the politicians are not working between themselves to deliver that.
I think it's a bit worse than that. The method we have for public consultation is a rabbit hole. The processes that planners and councils and governments need to go through now are captured by small numbers of vested interests, by the people who know how to work the system, and by an endless round and round and round and round process that never goes anywhere, and at the end of it produces a group of people who said no one ever talked to us, and of course it's just nonsense. There are much better ways to do democracy than that.
Can I put a challenging question from one of our participants? I'll read the whole thing. It's easy for us in the building industry to assume that sustainable buildings / infrastructure is paramount. However, there may be an argument that a sustainable community is more important and more urgent than sustainable construction, jobs, stable families, mental health. Is there anyone on the panel who would be able to present both sides of that argument?
Well, actually, maybe you don't need to present both sides. Maybe they're both reconcilable. Maybe you can achieve both. So maybe you can achieve the sustainable outcomes and achieve good mental health and community outcomes if you design sustainably. I'm not sure I completely understand the question, Rod.
I think it's about whether there should be an emphasis first on sustainable community before we move on to the sustainable built environment. But I certainly take your point that not ideally, but the best way of doing this would be to progress both simultaneously, and the two become mutually reinforcing.
It can actually be an output from good design processes where you have stakeholders and users involved in the design, and you actually can have good outcomes achieved as you also build, so it can be an output.
Thank you. Shamabil.
Well, I just want to say that I think, the better built environment is a subset of a wider perspective of better outcomes for New Zealanders. I think we are all driving towards a better New Zealand. I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation to have or a set of values to have. The built environment is just one of those things that are very long-lived decisions. What we do now will leave a legacy for 100 years. So we can't choose to say we will park that for later. And that's why the built environment is so critical and urgent, because everything we do now gets locked in. yes, we should do those other things. It's not or. They're not in competition. What we do with welfare policy, what we do with health policy, what we do with mental health, those are all part and parcel of what we want out of our public service. But the reason why we're talking about the built environment is we don't have time to screw this up.
That's the theory behind the wellbeing budget, isn't it? The idea that everything is related and we need to have a holistic approach. And we understand that in theory, and in practice, the way government works, it's extremely hard. There are lots and lots of barriers to government agencies working together, and it's really unfortunate that that's the case. And it's very hard to even think in that integrated way. You take the situation we're in at the moment, it's just so easy for everybody to get obsessed about what's happening to the GDP, which is, I would have thought at this crisis point in our society, a really crazy way to be looking at where we are and what we need to do. But those are the mechanisms that people reach for.
Thank you. Speaking of one very specific mechanism, in the Q&A box, and I've just pasted this into chat as well, there's a message from one of our participants, Clausen. There is a public consultation from NB on building for climate change. So please review and complete the survey, and there's a link to that. We've just got precious few minutes left. Let me just highlight, not so much to raise an issue, I think they speak for themselves. So, for example, one person saying, there are passive house building standards out there. So why aren't we addressing the building code? Universal design also needs to be given much more greater attention and mandatory for public buildings. Some comments about the key to much of this or an aspect of it is rapid transport, and potentially the role for social procurement in policies, in projects too. So there's so thank you to people who are contributing these thoughts and these questions. In the one point I would like to make is that our Infrastructure Commission has rather belatedly got around to reviewing how climate change fits into its work, and that's a process that doesn't bear fruit until next year. But it's really important to recognise that, for example, the UK Infrastructure Commission, the UK equivalent, already has a mandate in there to ensure that all the work it's involved in is very specifically geared to and is delivering towards a net zero emissions economy in the UK. So if we could influence our Infrastructure Commission to make that sort of commitment, and the government mandated to that, that would be very helpful indeed. Look, I just very briefly want to thank you all as panelists, Simon and Adrian and Jenny and Shambil. Thank you very much for your contributions and your comments and your thoughtful answers to questions. And thank you, all of you who have been participating. We've had close to 100 people online, which has been wonderful. A recording of this webinar will very soon be on the Green Building Council's website, along with the recordings of the other sessions over the course of the week. So please have a look at those, and please do recommend them to your friends and colleagues, and hopefully that will help stimulate more discussion about all of the aspects we've been looking at over the course of the week. And lastly, a very big thank you to Neil and Jen and Lena and Isabel at the Green Building Council for organising and preparing and running this webinar for us, and of course for producing the slides. And of course I would love to also thank the sponsors. You will see them up on the screen here. Temperzone, Rubik's, Rosine, Auckland Conversations, Jib, and who have helped make this program possible. So I want to wish you all the very best as you pursue your passions, and whether it be in work and other aspects of life, and the great themes that we've discussed. So stay well, look after yourself, and goodbye. Noho ora mai. Goodbye.